When German pilots first encountered the P-47 Thunderbolt in the skies over Europe, they didn't know exactly what they were facing. From a distance, the aircraft appeared massive, bulky, and almost clumsy compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the deadly Focke-Wulf 190. To many Luftwaffe veterans who had fought since the early campaigns in Poland and France, this new American machine looked like an overweight target, rather than a predator. But those first impressions vanished the moment the Thunderbolt closed in and unleashed its 8.50 caliber machine guns. What followed was nothing short of a nightmare for the German pilots, and it marked the beginning of an era where even seasoned aces would think twice before engaging these heavily armed giants of the sky. The P-47's guns were not just weapons. They were a storm of lead that could fill the air with over 100 rounds per second. Imagine a German pilot diving toward what he assumed was a sluggish opponent, expecting his own burst of cannon fire to tear into the American fuselage. But before he could line up a clean shot, the P-47 banked with surprising agility, and in a fraction of a second the sky in front of the German fighter turned into a wall of tracers. Those 8 Brownings, mounted 4 to a wing, didn't just fire, they ripped the air apart, shredding anything in their path. Pilots described seeing their comrades' aircraft literally disintegrate, wings snapping, engines exploding, cockpits engulfed in fire, all within moments of being struck. The sheer concentration of firepower made it almost impossible for a German fighter to survive a direct hit. The psychological shock was immense. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to measure their odds before diving into combat, but the Thunderbolt presented them with something they had not seen before. A machine that combined speed, ruggedness, and devastating firepower in a single package. At first, they dismissed the P-47 as too heavy to compete with their nimble aircraft. Yet in combat, the Thunderbolt's massive radial engine allowed it to dive faster than almost any plane in the theater, giving American pilots a deadly advantage. A German ace might out-turn his opponent briefly, but if he ended up in the gunsights of a P-47, the battle was over before it began. The sound of those Brownings firing together was unforgettable. A thunderous roar that echoed across the sky and often marked the last sound a German pilot ever heard. Reports from Luftwaffe survivors painted grim pictures of these first clashes. One pilot described how his squadron intercepted a group of Thunderbolts escorting bombers. Confident in their numbers and experience, they pressed the attack, only to watch in horror as the first 2 German aircraft were ripped to pieces in seconds. The .50 caliber rounds didn't just pierce aluminum. They smashed through armor plating, ignited fuel tanks, and tore control surfaces apart. Pilots who managed to bail out spoke of feeling their planes shake violently, as though hit by a hurricane before flames forced them to leap for their lives. Others never had the chance to escape at all. In the span of a few minutes, the reputation of the Thunderbolt was cemented, and word spread quickly through Luftwaffe squadrons that this was no ordinary opponent. It wasn't only the firepower that left German pilots stunned. It was the durability of the P-47 itself. Even if a Luftwaffe fighter managed to land hits with cannon shells, the Thunderbolt seemed to absorb punishment like no other aircraft. Its radial engine could keep running even after taking direct fire, and its thick armor shielded pilots long enough for them to fight back. To the Germans, it felt like dueling a flying fortress on a smaller scale. They could not believe that a fighter so large could still dogfight effectively, and then unleash a torrent of fire that shredded their most advanced machines. The mismatch in survivability only added to the fear. Luftwaffe pilots knew that even if they damaged a Thunderbolt, it might still return to base and fight again another day, while their own aircraft often went down in flames with the first burst of American fire. For the German command, these reports were troubling. The Luftwaffe had been stretched thin, and every loss of an experienced pilot weakened their ability to defend the Reich. When squadrons reported that they were losing aircraft at alarming rates to Thunderbolts, commanders initially believed it was an exaggeration, a result of poor tactics or bad luck. But as more missions ended in disaster, it became clear that this new American fighter was a serious threat. Morale among Luftwaffe units began to erode. Pilots who had once flown fearlessly against Spitfires and Mustangs now hesitated when they saw the broad wings and rugged frame of the P-47. The thought of flying into a storm of 8.50 calibers caused even veterans to flinch. Every encounter became a gamble, one where a single mistake could mean instant destruction. For the Americans, those first encounters were proof that their design philosophy had worked. The Thunderbolt had been mocked as the Jug because of its sheer size and weight, but in combat its juggernaut qualities became its greatest strength. U.S. pilots quickly learned that closing in for a firing pass was almost a guaranteed kill. They didn't have to rely on pinpoint accuracy. Just getting their target into the cone of fire was enough. A burst of tracers often meant watching a German aircraft burst into flames or break apart. The shock value alone was a weapon. German formations that once pressed their attacks with confidence now scattered when the Thunderbolts turned to face them. Each successful mission added to the legend of the P-47 and spread more fear among the enemy as months went by. Stories circulated among German airfields about the brutal effectiveness of the Thunderbolt. New recruits heard grim warnings from their seniors. Avoid the big American fighter if you can, because its guns will tear you to pieces. Those who had survived encounters described the tracers as looking like fiery ropes stretching across the sky. Impossible to dodge once you were caught in their path. The Luftwaffe had faced many challenges, but few were as demoralizing as realizing that a single American fighter could outgun and outlast entire squadrons if given the chance. The Thunderbolt didn't just win dogfights, it crushed morale, and that psychological blow was just as important as the physical destruction it caused. The 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted on the P-47 Thunderbolt were more than just weapons bolted to a fighter's wings. They were the embodiment of American industrial firepower translated into the air war. Each wing carried 4 of these guns, perfectly synchronized to deliver an overwhelming concentration of fire that could obliterate anything in their path. German pilots who were used to facing opponents with 2, maybe 4 guns at most, suddenly found themselves under attack from a storm of lead that seemed impossible to escape. The design philosophy behind these guns was simple, but brutally effective. If you can't guarantee accuracy with a few rounds, make sure you overwhelm the target with so many bullets that escape becomes nearly impossible. The Thunderbolt wasn't just armed, it was armed to dominate. The 50 caliber round itself was a fearsome piece of ammunition, nearly half an inch in diameter, heavy enough to smash through armor, traveling at supersonic speeds, and carrying enough energy to ignite fuel tanks or shatter control surfaces. It was devastating against both fighters and bombers, 1 or 2. 50 cal hits might cripple a lighter plane, but when you had 8 firing at once, each gun capable of spitting out 800 rounds per minute, the results were catastrophic. A single firing pass from a P-47 could unleash nearly 100 bullets in a single second, a torrent of destruction no aluminum airframe could withstand. Pilots who saw the damage afterward spoke of wings that looked like Swiss cheese, engines torn apart, and cockpits turned into twisted wreckage. Entire aircraft simply disintegrated under the concentrated fury of those Brownings. For Luftwaffe pilots, the first time they experienced this was a shock. German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fu-190 often carried 20 mm cannons, which fired slower but with explosive shells that could devastate a target in 1 or 2 hits. Their pilots prided themselves on precision, carefully lining up their shots before unleashing short bursts that could down an enemy. The Americans, on the other hand, brought a different philosophy: volume of fire. The P-47's pilots didn't need to wait for the perfect angle or line up an ideal shot. Once the target was inside that lethal cone, they pressed the trigger, and the sky lit up with a hurricane of tracers. In combat, this often meant that German pilots, who might dodge 1 or 2 shells from a cannon, suddenly found themselves trying to escape a curtain of bullets that filled the air like an iron wall. The psychological effect of this weaponry cannot be understated. Luftwaffe reports describe the unnerving sight of seeing streams of tracers coming from the P-47's wings, converging like fiery threads toward a single point. Once you were caught in that web, survival was unlikely. Some German veterans admitted they never feared American planes until they saw what the Thunderbolt could do with its guns. In a matter of seconds, Entire formations could be cut apart. Even if you managed to break away, your plane was often riddled with holes, leaking fuel, struggling to stay in the air. The thought of being caught in a Thunderbolt's sights was terrifying enough that many German pilots began to avoid head-on engagements altogether, preferring to attack bombers and disengage before the escorts could respond. The durability of the .50 caliber system also played a crucial role. Unlike cannons, which could jam or run out of ammo quickly, the Brownings were reliable workhorses, capable of sustained fire in all conditions. P-47 pilots knew they could rely on their weapons every single mission, which gave them tremendous confidence in combat. They could strafe ground targets, tear apart supply convoys, and still have enough ammunition left to fight off interceptors. The sheer versatility of the 8.50 cals turned the Thunderbolt into not just a dogfighter, but a true multi-role machine. German troops on the ground came to dread the sound of those guns as much as the pilots did. Columns of vehicles were shredded in minutes, armored cars exploded under relentless fire, and even tanks could be disabled when exposed to concentrated attacks on weak points. For the Luftwaffe High Command, the presence of such weaponry raised alarm bells. Their own fighters were not designed to withstand this level of punishment. Even the heavily armored Fu-190 struggled to survive once caught in a burst from 8 Brownings. Engineers worked tirelessly to add more armor or modify tactics, but the truth was brutal. There was no simple defense against sheer firepower delivered at this scale. The Americans had effectively created a flying meat grinder, and every pilot who faced it knew that once those guns opened fire, there was little chance of escape. Unlike other planes that relied on maneuverability or surprise, the Thunderbolt relied on brute force, and brute force won battles, just as surely as finesse American pilots loved their guns, and they used them with ruthless efficiency. After-action reports were filled with stories of single P-47s cutting down multiple German aircraft in a single mission. Some pilots described the satisfaction of seeing enemy planes break apart in their sights, knowing that their firepower left little room for survival. Others admitted that the overwhelming destructive capability sometimes shocked even them, as they watched opponents who never stood a chance disintegrate in mid-air. The 8.50 cals became not just tools of war, but symbols of American dominance in the skies, reminders that industrial might and raw firepower could shift the balance of air combat. German pilots could boast about skill and tactics, but against that kind of firepower, skill was often meaningless in time. The reputation of the P-47's guns spread like wildfire. German recruits were warned of their destructive potential before ever facing one in combat. Veterans swapped stories of friends who had gone down in flames after a single burst from a Thunderbolt. The psychological weight of these stories sometimes decided battles before they even began. Luftwaffe pilots, already fighting against dwindling numbers and fuel shortages, now had to reckon with the knowledge that every encounter with a Thunderbolt was a deadly gamble. It wasn't just another fighter. It was a machine built to shred, and its guns were the very reason why. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared in European skies, many Luftwaffe pilots dismissed it almost instantly. To their eyes, it was not a sleek predator like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf Fu-190, but a bloated, clumsy brute. Its fuselage looked wide and heavy, its engine oversized, and its wings massive compared to the streamlined fighters German engineers had perfected. At briefing tables, German squadron leaders assured their men that this American machine posed little threat in a turning fight. They joked that it looked more like a flying milk jug than a combat-ready aircraft. The nickname, Jug, spread even among Allied pilots, though for the Germans it was often used with ridicule. They believed that the Thunderbolt's bulk would make it easy prey for their nimble, battle-tested fighters. These early assumptions were rooted in the Luftwaffe's long history of dominance. Since the Blitzkrieg days, German pilots had fought, and often defeated, air forces across Europe. Their machines were designed for agility, precision, and lethal firepower. When they looked at the P-47, they assumed it was an American attempt to build a bomber disguised as a fighter. How could something so large possibly compete in the tight, twisting dogfights over France or the high-speed duels above Germany? The The belief was that any skilled German ace could outmaneuver the P-47, close in, and blast it out of the sky before it could respond. Confidence turned into arrogance, and many Luftwaffe units welcomed the chance to face this clumsy, new opponent, but those first encounters in the air shattered these assumptions quickly. German pilots discovered that the Thunderbolt, while heavy, was not sluggish. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine gave it tremendous power, and though it might not match a Bf-109 in a tight horizontal turn, it had other advantages the Germans had not anticipated. The P-47 could dive faster than almost anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal, its weight working as an ally rather than a weakness. A German pilot trying to chase a Thunderbolt into a dive often found himself outpaced, his controls stiffening as his aircraft approached the limits of safety, while the American machine roared ahead with frightening stability. This single advantage overturned much of the Luftwaffe's tactical confidence, because what they thought was a fat, clumsy fighter was actually a predator that chose when and how to fight. The Thunderbolt's bulk also concealed another strength: survivability. German pilots learned that hitting a P-47 was only half the battle. Even when shells connected, the American fighter absorbed damage with shocking resilience. Fuel tanks were protected, engines kept running despite damage, and cockpits were reinforced to shield the pilot. Many Luftwaffe fighters, by comparison, were designed for speed and agility, not durability. A few hits from .50 caliber rounds could cripple a Bf-109, but the Thunderbolt could often take hits from cannons and still keep flying. This turned every engagement into a war of attrition the Germans were not prepared for. They had assumed the bulky frame meant weakness. In reality, it meant armor and strength. Eyewitness accounts from Luftwaffe survivors reflect the shift in perception. One pilot recalled diving onto a Thunderbolt from above, certain he would rip it apart with a burst of cannon fire. His shells struck home, smoke poured from the American fighter, and for a brief moment he thought victory was his. Then, to his horror, the P-47 rolled, leveled its guns, and unleashed a torrent of firepower that tore his wingmen to pieces. The damaged Jug didn't just survive, it fought back. And it fought back harder than anything he had seen before. Stories like these spread quickly, and soon the mocking laughter about the flying milk jug gave way to whispered warnings. This was not a slow, defenseless machine, it was a juggernaut, built to trade blows and come out alive. The Luftwaffe's assumptions also collapsed when they realized how effective the Thunderbolt was at high altitude. German fighters were often optimized for performance at medium altitudes, but the P-47 excelled where American bombers flew. This meant that whenever B-17s or B-24s entered German skies, Thunderbolts were there to guard them. The bulk that once seemed ridiculous now revealed itself as part of a design meant for range, power, and protection. German pilots, accustomed to pouncing on bomber formations, suddenly had to face a fighter that could match their climb, dive past their defenses, and unleash overwhelming firepower before they could react. Their assumption that the Thunderbolt would crumble under pressure had left them unprepared for the brutal reality of fighting it. In time, the Luftwaffe adjusted their tactics, but the psychological damage of those early assumptions lingered. Every German pilot who had laughed at the Jug had either lost friends to it, or had come face to face with its firepower and lived to tell the tale. Respect replaced ridicule. The Germans no longer spoke of it as clumsy, but as dangerously deceptive. A fighter that looked heavy, but could turn into a nightmare in seconds. Their intelligence reports began to reflect this shift, warning squadrons to treat Thunderbolts with caution, to avoid prolonged engagements, and to never underestimate its power. By then, however, the Americans had already proven the Jug's worth, and German skies grew more dangerous with every passing week. The story of those early assumptions is a reminder of how overconfidence can blind even the most experienced warriors. The Luftwaffe thought they were facing a joke, but they were staring at one of the most formidable fighters of the war. What began as arrogance turned into bitter respect, as the bulky P-47 proved that sometimes strength lies not in elegance, but in raw power, survivability, and overwhelming fire. German pilots learned that lesson the hard way, and many never lived long enough to pass it on. The true dominance of the P-47 Thunderbolt revealed itself not in tight-turning duels, but in the way American pilots learned to exploit its greatest strengths: high-altitude performance, blistering diving speed, and an unmatched ruggedness that made it almost indestructible in the air. While German pilots expected dogfights to unfold in the same style they had flown since the early campaigns, close, twisting engagements where the lighter Bf-109 or Fu-190 could out-turn an opponent, U.S. pilots developed a very different approach. They knew the Jug wasn't built for ballot in the sky. It was built to hit like a hammer. And once they realized how to fight on their own terms, the Thunderbolt became a predator that dictated when and how every battle was fought at higher altitudes, where the cold thinned the air and engines gasped for oxygen. The P-47 came alive. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, paired with a turbo supercharger, gave it extraordinary performance above 25,000 feet, a ceiling where many German fighters began to struggle. American bomber formations flew high, and this was the natural hunting ground for the Jug. German pilots who tried to climb up and intercept flying fortresses often found themselves intercepted by Thunderbolts waiting like hawks above the bombers. From that perch, the P-47 could dive with terrifying speed, using gravity and raw power to swoop down on its prey. A German pilot might spot a P-47 above him and think he had time to maneuver. But once the Jug tipped forward, its bulk turned into momentum, and its guns spat death in a diving pass that lasted only seconds. The Germans soon realized they couldn't follow. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame allowed it to dive faster and more safely than the Bf-109 or even the rugged Fu-190. A Luftwaffe pilot attempting to chase into such a dive risked structural failure. Controls stiffened, wings shook violently, and more than one German fighter broke apart, trying to match the Jug's descent. American pilots learned to use this advantage ruthlessly. They attacked from altitude, fired their devastating 8.50 calibers, and then simply dove away, leaving German survivors flailing in their wake. It was a tactic as old as air combat itself: boom and zoom. But in the P-47 it was elevated to perfection. The Germans might circle and climb, hoping for a chance to strike back. But the Jug's pilots never needed to fight on their terms. They chose the moment to appear, strike, and vanish again into the clouds. The ruggedness of the Thunderbolt only reinforced this style of combat. German cannon shells that might cripple a Spitfire or Mustang often failed to bring down a P-47. Its radial engine could keep running even with cylinders blown apart. Its thick armor shielded pilots from shrapnel, and self-sealing fuel tanks meant fires were less common. Stories spread among U.S. squadrons of Jugs returning to base riddled with holes, missing parts of wings or tail sections, yet still flying straight and true. For American pilots, this durability meant confidence. They could take risks that others could not, diving through flak to strafe ground targets or charging headlong into enemy formations, knowing their aircraft could take punishment and still fight its way home. For the Germans, this resilience was demoralizing. It seemed that no matter how much damage they inflicted, the Jug kept coming back. Eyewitness accounts highlight how this combination of diving speed and toughness turned engagements into one-sided affairs. A Luftwaffe pilot might spot a formation of P-47s high above and warn his comrades over the radio. Moments later, the sky would fill with tracer fire as the Thunderbolts screamed downward, shredding planes with bursts of .50 caliber rounds before pulling away into steep dives. The Germans tried to regroup, but their numbers dwindled rapidly, and those who survived often returned with holes in their fuselages and nerves shaken. For them, the Jug was not just another enemy aircraft. It was a force of nature, striking like thunder from above and vanishing before they could retaliate. That unpredictability, the knowledge that death could come suddenly from the heights, wore heavily on Luftwaffe morale. American pilots refined these tactics further with discipline and coordination. Instead of chasing duels, they flew in pairs or groups, covering each other as they executed diving passes. One flight of P-47s could scatter an entire German formation, using their altitude advantage to control the tempo. Even when outnumbered, they retained the initiative, striking hard and then disengaging before the enemy could counter. German aces accustomed to dictating the fight now found themselves reacting, constantly looking up, never sure when a Thunderbolt would swoop down. This reversal of roles, hunters turning into hunted, was perhaps the most significant psychological blow of all. No longer could the Luftwaffe count on their agility to save them against the Jug. Agility meant nothing if you couldn't catch it. The ruggedness also meant that the P-47 was not confined to the skies. It could dive to ground level and deliver devastating strafing runs against trains, convoys, and airfields, then climb back into the fight against enemy fighters. German pilots who thought they could surprise returning Jugs found themselves facing opponents that had already soaked up flak from the ground and still had enough firepower to shred them in the air. It was a versatility that the Luftwaffe couldn't match, and it spread fear among both ground troops and airmen. The Jug didn't just dominate in one arena. It dominated everywhere it went for the Germans. These encounters forced a painful reassessment. The heavy fighter they had mocked turned out to be a high-altitude executioner, a machine that leveraged its supposed weaknesses into unmatched strengths. They could no longer rely on climbing to meet bombers unopposed. They could no longer count on diving speed to escape. And they could no longer hope that damaging an American fighter would mean its destruction. The Thunderbolt rewrote the rules, and German pilots paid the price in blood and wreckage. As the war dragged on, this combination of altitude advantage, diving power, and ruggedness allowed the Jug to carve out a reputation that no amount of German propaganda could erase. Pilots who once laughed at its bulk now spoke of it with grudging respect, even fear. They knew that whenever they looked up and saw those broad wings silhouetted against the sky, danger was coming. And once the Jug dove, there was little they could do to stop it. The stories that emerged from those who witnessed German aircraft being torn apart by the concentrated fire of the P-47 Thunderbolts 8.50 caliber machine guns are some of the most chilling accounts of aerial combat in World War II. To understand the impact, you have to imagine what it was like to be there, thousands of feet above the ground, where speed, noise, and chaos ruled the skies. A German pilot might have been engaged in what he thought was a routine interception of American bombers, when suddenly the world around him dissolved into fire and metal. One moment his comrade's fighter was banking steadily. The next it was engulfed in tracers, ripped apart so violently that it seemed to vanish in an instant. Survivors who lived to tell the tale spoke of scenes that haunted them long after they returned to base. In the heat of combat, the P-47's guns produced a storm of destruction that the Luftwaffe had never experienced before. 8 Brownings firing together created a stream of fire so dense that it almost appeared solid. German pilots who were unlucky enough to fly into that torrent were rarely seen again. One account tells of a Bf-109 caught broadside by a Thunderbolt's burst. Within seconds its wings were sheared off, the fuselage spun violently, and the cockpit disintegrated as though struck by a giant hammer. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Another report described a Fu-1990 that was hit during a head-on pass. Witnesses said the nose exploded instantly, and flaming debris rained down over the countryside. These scenes were not isolated. They became familiar to both sides, and they created a fear among German pilots that no training could erase the intensity of the 50 caliber strikes often left nothing salvageable. Aircraft didn't just fall. They disintegrated mid-air, scattering fragments across the sky. Pilots in nearby planes sometimes found themselves dodging pieces of their comrades' wreckage. Burning engines, shredded wings, or even pieces of cockpit glass. The psychological toll was immense. To watch an ally vanish in a heartbeat consumed by fire and torn metal was to be reminded that survival in a Thunderbolt's sights was almost impossible. For the Germans, it meant flying with the constant fear that the next streak of tracers would end their lives. For the Americans, it reinforced their confidence. Every squeeze of the trigger could end a fight before the enemy had a chance to fire back. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled in a post-war interview how a single burst from a Thunderbolt annihilated an entire formation of 3 fighters. The first was struck directly and exploded. The second veered to avoid the wreckage, but was caught in the same stream of fire, and the third broke apart after a brief, desperate attempt to roll away. The American pilot later wrote in his combat report that he had only pressed the trigger for a few seconds. But in that time the air in front of him filled with fire, and when it cleared, 3 enemy planes were gone. The efficiency of destruction was staggering. German airmen, who had once been masters of the skies, suddenly felt like targets lined up for execution. Eyewitnesses also described the sounds of battle, the terrifying roars and cracks that accompanied a Jug's attack. The 50 cals didn't just spit fire. They thundered like rolling drums, filling the air with a mechanical roar that echoed through the cockpits of friend and foe alike. German pilots later said they could sometimes hear the roar of a Thunderbolt's guns, even through the noise of their own engines. It was a sound that froze blood, because they knew it meant death was close. One described it as the sound of doom, a mechanical thunder that grew louder until it consumed everything. By the time you heard it clearly, it was already too late. Not all stories came from the air. German ground troops stationed near airfields or bomber routes often saw the aftermath of these mid-air killings. They would watch helplessly as fighters spiraled out of control, trailing black smoke, wings shredded like paper, before crashing in fields or forests with explosions that shook the earth. Sometimes parachutes opened, lonely white dots against the sky, but often there were none. The sheer violence of the Thunderbolts' fire left little chance for survival. Ground observers wrote of watching entire squadrons return in tatters, many with empty seats where comrades once flew. And the terror this inspired spread quickly through the Luftwaffe's ranks. American pilots, too, recorded their impressions of the devastation. Some admitted that the raw power of their guns shocked even them. They reported seeing enemy planes break apart after just a half-second burst, disintegrating before their eyes. One pilot confessed in his logbook that he almost felt guilty watching his target vanish so quickly, as though the fight had been unfair. Yet in war, efficiency was survival, and the Jug's pilots knew that their weapons gave them an advantage their enemies could not match. To them, the sight of German planes being torn to pieces was proof that they could dominate the skies. They learned to trust that once they lined up a shot, the enemy would not walk away, but for the Luftwaffe, those eyewitness accounts became warnings etched into memory. Pilots whispered to each other about what they had seen. Friends evaporating in fire, cockpits engulfed, aircraft turned into falling wreckage by a single burst. The effect was cumulative. Every story reinforced the belief that the P-47 was not just dangerous but unbeatable once it fired. That belief eroded morale, sapped courage, and created hesitation where once there had been confidence. In aerial combat, hesitation was often fatal, and the Thunderbolt exploited it mercilessly. The Germans might still have skill, training, and courage, but against the concentrated fury of 50 calibers, none of it seemed to matter. These stories circulated not only among pilots, but across entire Luftwaffe units. New recruits heard the warnings before they even climbed into their cockpits. Veterans carried the images with them, knowing that their own fate could be the same. The terror of watching a comrade torn apart in mid-air left scars that no training manual could erase. The Jug's firepower wasn't just a physical weapon. It was a psychological one, and it worked with ruthless efficiency. When comparing the P-47 Thunderbolt's 50 caliber Browning machine guns to the weaponry carried by German fighters such as the Bf 9 and Fu-190, the contrast is as much about philosophy as it is about hardware. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with a doctrine built on precision and efficiency. Their fighters often carried a pair of 7.929 machine guns and 1 or 2 20 mm cannons, sometimes upgraded to include a heavier 30 mm cannon on later models. These weapons packed a punch, especially the cannons, which could rip through a bomber or destroy a fighter with just a few well-placed hits. German pilots were trained to conserve ammunition, close in carefully, and deliver short, surgical bursts. They prided themselves on accuracy and discipline, knowing that every round had to count in long campaigns where resources grew scarcer by the month. The American approach with the Thunderbolt was very different. Instead of asking their pilots to become precision marksmen in chaotic dogfights, they gave them overwhelming firepower that allowed for flexibility, confidence, and intimidation. The 50 calibers of the P-47 could deliver an incredible volume of fire, up to 6,400 rounds per minute combined. By contrast, a Bf 109 typically carried 120 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 synchronized machine guns firing over the cowling. The Fo-190, the Luftwaffe's heavier hitter, carried 2 cannons in the wing roots, sometimes supplemented by additional guns depending on the variant. These could devastate a target in skilled hands, but they lacked the sheer saturation effect of the Jug's battery. In battle, this difference became painfully clear. A German pilot might line up for a perfect deflection shot, fire a short burst, and hope his cannon shells struck a vital part of the enemy plane. If they hit, the damage was often catastrophic, but if they missed, or if the shells glanced off, the opportunity was lost and precious ammunition was wasted. By contrast, an American pilot in a P-47 didn't need such precision. He could unleash a burst of several hundred, 50 caliber rounds that filled the sky ahead of him. Even if his aim was imperfect, the density of fire gave him a high probability of hitting something vital: the engine, cockpit, or fuel tanks. Against lightly built German fighters, just a handful of hits could be fatal. The psychological effect of this imbalance was enormous. German pilots often remarked on the sheer unfairness of facing so much concentrated fire. They were used to duels where accuracy and skill decided the outcome, but against the Jug it felt like being trapped in front of a machine gun nest in the sky. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled how unnerving it was to see a P-47 open fire tracers streamed outward like ropes of fire, and the volume was so great that dodging seemed impossible. Even if he banked hard, a few rounds almost always struck home. Each impact shook his fragile aircraft, tearing holes in the fuselage, smashing control surfaces, or setting fuel lines ablaze. The differences in ammunition loadouts further widened the gap. German fighters typically carried fewer rounds per gun, particularly for their cannons, which were limited in supply. A Bf-109 might only carry 200 rounds for its 20 mm cannon, enough for 10 or 12 seconds of firing at most. The Fo-190 had more but still required discipline and restraint. The P-47, on the other hand, often carried nearly 500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. This meant American pilots could engage multiple times during a mission, strafe ground targets, and still have enough left to fight enemy fighters. German pilots, constrained by their limited firepower, often found themselves retreating simply because they had exhausted their ammunition. The difference wasn't just about quantity, it was about adaptability. The 50 caliber Brownings, with their high rate of fire, were deadly against fighters, but they were also effective against bombers, armored vehicles, and ground convoys. German cannons, while powerful, were less versatile and often less reliable in prolonged engagements. If a cannon jammed, a German pilot might be left nearly defenseless. The Brownings, by contrast, were famously durable and rarely failed in combat. Pilots trusted their guns, and that trust translated into aggressive flying. German commanders eventually recognized that their fighters were being outgunned, but by then the damage was done. Pilots returning from missions spoke of being unable to close in on bombers because of the wall of fire from escorting Thunderbolts. Even when they managed to engage, the sheer volume of American fire left them shaken. The Fo-190, designed as a rugged bomber killer, found itself shredded by the very escorts it was meant to evade. The Bf-109, lighter and more nimble, simply could not take hits from the Jug's 50 calibers. Comparisons made after the war revealed that the Thunderbolt's weapons inflicted not just more kills but more complete destruction, leaving little for recovery teams to salvage. The cultural clash in design philosophies became starkly evident. Germany, with limited resources and a focus on high skill precision, relied on cannons that could destroy in a few hits but required perfect execution. The United States, with vast industrial capacity, emphasized overwhelming force, mass-produced fighters armed to the teeth, flown by pilots who could rely on firepower to make up for missed shots. In the skies over Europe, that philosophy proved decisive. The Jug's guns didn't just match the Luftwaffe, they surpassed it in every meaningful way. The legacy of this comparison was clear to those who survived. German pilots admitted after the war that the Thunderbolt's firepower was one of the most terrifying aspects of fighting the Americans. Even if they had the advantage in maneuverability, even if they struck first, the knowledge that a single mistake could place them in the path of 8 converging streams of 50 caliber fire weighed heavily on their minds. Against that kind of weaponry, skill was not enough. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological impact of facing the P-47 Thunderbolt was as devastating as the physical destruction it caused. German pilots had grown accustomed to a certain balance in the skies. Even when outnumbered, they often believed their skill, experience, and aircraft design could give them a fighting chance. But when the Thunderbolt appeared with its 8.50 caliber machine guns, that confidence began to erode. The shock wasn't just that the Jug could destroy their planes. It was that even their most rugged, heavily armored fighters and attack aircraft were no match for its firepower. The realization that armor, maneuverability, and experience could no longer guarantee survival sent a ripple of fear through the Luftwaffe ranks. Consider the Fu-190, often praised by German pilots as a butcher bird, a machine that could shred enemy bombers and still hold its own in a dogfight. Its armor protection was superior to the Bf-109, and Luftwaffe pilots trusted it to survive encounters that might kill them in lighter machines. Yet even the Fu-190 proved frighteningly vulnerable when caught in the P-47's sights. Reports describe the Jug's 50 caliber rounds tearing through its fuselage, ripping control surfaces apart, and setting engines ablaze despite its heavy plating. For a German pilot who believed his machine was rugged enough to take punishment, seeing comrades in FWY-90s shredded in seconds was a brutal wake-up call. It was no longer about skill. It was about who could survive long enough to pull the trigger, and against the Jug. Survival was never assured. The psychological toll was magnified by the Thunderbolt's ability to deliver destruction in such overwhelming volume. German pilots often remarked that a single burst from the Jug looked and felt like being hit by an entire squadron's firepower. Tracers streaked through the air in thick, converging streams, and within moments aircraft simply disintegrated. Pilots who narrowly escaped described the sickening sound of bullets hammering their wings, the smell of burning fuel, and the sight of their squadron, mates turning into fireballs beside them. Those memories never left them. Each mission afterward carried the weight of dread. What if the next burst was meant for me? Even bombers and ground attack aircraft, which were designed with reinforced armor and self-sealing tanks, were not safe. Luftwaffe pilots who flew Ju-8As, He-111s, or even the fearsome Stuka dive bombers learned quickly that if a Thunderbolt lined up behind them, their odds of survival were slim. The 50 caliber rounds didn't just pierce, they shredded. Gunners sometimes returned fire desperately, only to be silenced in seconds as the Jug's concentrated storm of bullets ripped through turrets and cockpits. To German bomber crews, the sight of Thunderbolts appearing alongside the bombers they were attacking was demoralizing in the extreme. Many admitted they felt powerless, knowing that their missions had turned from offensive strikes into suicide runs. When the Jug was in the air, the psychological pressure extended beyond the battlefield into daily life. At Luftwaffe bases, stories of the Thunderbolt circulated with increasing intensity. Pilots shared grim tales of squadrons torn apart, of comrades who never made it back, of aircraft that had once seemed invincible now falling like autumn leaves. New recruits, eager but untested, heard these stories and felt their confidence waver before they even flew their first mission. Veterans, hardened by years of combat, began to acknowledge openly that the skies were no longer theirs. Every time they looked up and saw the broad wings and bulky silhouette of a P-47, they felt the cold weight of inevitability. The Jug had become a symbol of American dominance, a reminder that their days of mastery were over. The cumulative effect was hesitation, and hesitation in combat was deadly. Luftwaffe pilots who once attacked boldly now second-guessed themselves. Should they engage a bomber formation with Thunderbolts circling above? Should they risk chasing an American fighter, knowing others might be waiting to pounce from altitude? The moment of doubt was often all it took for disaster to strike. U.S. pilots exploited this hesitation mercilessly, diving from above while their enemies flinched, pouring fire into aircraft that never had a chance to escape. What had once been confident aggression turned into cautious, fearful survival. And in the unforgiving world of aerial combat, fear was fatal. The effect of the Thunderbolt strikes extended even further when combined with its reputation for durability. German pilots knew that even if they managed to hit a P-47, it might not go down. They might expend precious cannon shells riddling the jug with holes, only to watch it shrug off the damage, turn, and unleash its 8 guns in reply. The thought that their best efforts might not even bring down their opponent was crushing. In contrast, they knew that just a short burst from those same guns could annihilate their own aircraft. That imbalance, the sense that the fight was hopelessly one-sided, sapped morale in ways no number of speeches or propaganda could repair. Psychologists studying combat stress after the war noted that fear is amplified by unpredictability. For the Luftwaffe, the unpredictability came from the jug's overwhelming ability to appear suddenly, strike with unmatched ferocity, and vanish before they could retaliate. A mission that began with optimism could end in horror within minutes. Pilots never knew when the next squadron of Thunderbolts would arrive, or how many would survive the first engagement. This constant uncertainty frayed nerves and eroded discipline. Men who had once flown with pride for the Reich now fought with the knowledge that they were outmatched, outgunned, and outlasted by 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence reports reflected this psychological collapse. Commanders warned that Thunderbolts were crushing morale across multiple units. Some pilots admitted openly that they dreaded missions into areas where the jug was active. Others began to describe the aircraft not just as an opponent, but as an executioner. Its firepower, its durability, its altitude dominance, all of it combined into an image of inevitability. Against the P-47, even courage seemed futile. And when soldiers begin to feel that courage is futile, defeat is no longer a possibility, it becomes a certainty. When the Luftwaffe first confronted American bomber streams crossing into German skies, they believed they could manage the threat with tried and true tactics. Their Bf-109s and FO-190s were experienced interceptors, and their pilots were veterans of countless battles over Europe. At first, the strategy was simple: climb to altitude, swarm the bombers, and use concentrated cannon fire to tear into the tight formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses or B-24 Liberators. For a time, these tactics worked, and the Americans suffered heavy losses. But everything began to change once the P-47 Thunderbolts appeared as escorts, and with them came the fear that grew steadily among German pilots, until it haunted every mission. The Thunderbolt's role as a bomber escort was perfectly suited to its strengths. With its turbo, supercharged engine, the jug thrived at high altitudes where the bombers flew. It could climb with them, keep pace, and loiter in the skies for long enough to protect the formations deep into German territory. Once positioned, the Thunderbolts turned the tables on the Luftwaffe. The Germans could no longer dive in, attack, and retreat with impunity. Every approach to the bombers now risked a head-on clash with heavily armed escorts. Those 8.50 caliber Brownings weren't just weapons against fighters. They were also perfectly capable of blasting apart a German interceptor before it could even line up on a bomber. Eyewitnesses described how Luftwaffe pilots would break formation when they spotted Thunderbolts circling above the bombers like hawks. The escorts rarely wasted energy chasing lone attackers at first. Instead, they waited for the Germans to commit, then dove with lethal precision. German pilots who pressed their attacks found themselves ambushed from above, often without warning. Entire formations were scattered as P-47s tore through their ranks, firing bursts that sent fighters spiraling down in flames. The very sight of the jug became enough to force hesitation. Veterans who had once dived boldly into American bomber streams now found themselves hesitating, calculating whether the attack was worth the near certainty of being mauled by escorts. That hesitation was exactly what the Americans needed to protect their bombers. The growing fear was compounded by the jug's reputation for survivability. German pilots knew their chances of damaging or destroying a Thunderbolt in the midst of a fast, moving engagement were slim. Even if they managed to score hits, the jug often powered through, still firing, still fighting, and still able to bring down its attacker. Many Luftwaffe pilots admitted after the war that the psychological weight of seeing their own comrades torn apart while Thunderbolts shrugged off damage broke their will to attack effectively. Escort missions that should have been opportunities for victory instead became battles of survival, and every mission deeper into German airspace carried the risk of catastrophic losses. The fear extended beyond individual dogfights. At a strategic level, Luftwaffe squadrons began to realize that Thunderbolts meant the Americans could now project power deeper into Germany than ever before. Previously, German pilots could expect some relief once the bombers reached maximum escort range. Once the fighters had to turn back, the bombers were vulnerable. But as the Jug's range was extended with drop tanks, those safe zones disappeared. Missions over cities, factories, and supply lines once thought to be beyond the reach of escorted bombers suddenly came under relentless attack. For the Germans, the psychological impact was immense. It felt as though there was no sanctuary, no corner of the Reich where the bombers could not reach, and no attack against them that would not be punished by swarms of Thunderbolts waiting overhead. The Luftwaffe's tactics began to unravel under this pressure. Commanders encouraged their pilots to adapt, to strike from different angles, to attack in larger numbers, or to try to lure escorts away from the bombers. But the Jug's firepower and durability nullified many of these efforts. Escorts could break apart attacking formations with terrifying efficiency, often before they reached the bombers. Survivors returned to base shaken, speaking of the walls of tracer fire, of comrades shredded in seconds, of P-47s appearing from the sun or from cloud banks, diving with unstoppable momentum. These stories spread rapidly, feeding the dread among squadrons that each mission was a gamble with their lives. Morale within the Luftwaffe eroded further as losses mounted. Pilots who had once been confident hunters of bombers began to describe themselves as prey. The knowledge that every bomber mission would now be accompanied by Thunderbolts weighed heavily on them before they even left the ground. Fear became part of the pre-flight routine, gnawing at their resolve. Some Luftwaffe veterans later admitted that by 1944, many pilots no longer believed victory was possible. They flew because they were ordered to, not because they expected to win. The Jug had become a symbol of inevitability, a reminder that every mission meant facing overwhelming firepower and almost certain losses for the Americans. This fear was as valuable as the destruction they caused. Escorting bombers was not just about shooting down enemy planes. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will to resist. Every time German pilots turned away, every time an attack was aborted, every time a squadron returned with fewer aircraft than it had launched, the Americans achieved their objective. The Jug didn't need to win every duel. It needed to make the Luftwaffe believe those duels were unwinnable. And by the time the bombing campaigns intensified in 1944, that belief had already taken hold. In the skies over Germany, the sight of a Thunderbolt meant more than just another enemy fighter. To the Luftwaffe, it meant their time was running out. Each escort mission pushed deeper, each wave of bombers carried heavier protection, and each engagement left more wreckage in its wake. Fear grew not just from what the Jug did, but from what it represented: an endless stream of American power that could not be stopped. By the end, Luftwaffe pilots looked up and saw not just a bulky fighter escorting bombers, but the shadow of defeat itself. Once the Luftwaffe realized that the P-47 Thunderbolt was not the sluggish, easy target they had once assumed, but rather a formidable opponent with strengths they could not ignore, they were forced to adapt their tactics. The German command knew that continuing their traditional methods, diving in aggressively on bomber streams, closing in tight for cannon shots, was suicidal when Thunderbolts prowled the skies. As word spread of squadrons shredded by the Jug's 8.50 calibers and of entire formations scattered before they even reached the bombers, the Luftwaffe began experimenting with ways to blunt the Thunderbolts' advantages. These adaptations were desperate measures born out of necessity, but none could fully neutralize the American fighter. One of the first shifts was in the way German pilots approached combat altitude. Knowing that the P-47 thrived at high altitudes thanks to its turbo, supercharged engine, Luftwaffe squadrons began to favor hit and run tactics from lower altitudes, climbing only when absolutely necessary to engage bombers. The hope was to avoid prolonged duels with Thunderbolts in the thin, icy air above 25,000 feet, where the Jug's power was greatest. Instead, they tried to strike bombers quickly, and then dive away before the escorts could react. But even here, the Germans found themselves at a disadvantage. The Thunderbolts' diving speed was unmatched, and American pilots learned to follow them down, closing the gap and cutting them apart with devastating bursts. What was intended as an escape often became a death sentence. Another adjustment was the use of massed formations. Instead of sending small flights to harass bombers, commanders began ordering larger, concentrated attacks in the hopes of overwhelming the escorts. The idea was simple: even Thunderbolts could not cover every angle. If enough German fighters pressed in at once, some might break through to the bombers. Yet these massed assaults often ended in disaster. Coordinated P-47 groups responded with devastating firepower, scattering German formations with coordinated dives and ambushes. The sky became a killing ground where outnumbered Thunderbolts fought like wolves, breaking the cohesion of Luftwaffe attacks and leaving stragglers easy prey. Rather than overwhelming the Jug, the Germans often found themselves offering more targets for its guns. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to exploit what they believed to be the Jug's one weakness: its relative lack of agility in tight turns. Pilots were instructed to draw Thunderbolts into low-altitude turning fights where the Bf-109 or 190 might hold the advantage. In practice, however, this rarely worked. American pilots had learned not to be baited into turning duels. They stuck to their strengths, diving and climbing instead of twisting in circles. On the rare occasions they were forced into turning battles, the Thunderbolt's ruggedness allowed it to survive longer than expected, often long enough to reposition and unleash its devastating firepower. German pilots who thought they had an edge soon discovered that even in close combat, the Jug could still fight viciously. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe experimented with heavier weaponry. They fitted some interceptors with 30 mm cannons, designed to punch through bomber armor in a single hit, reasoning that if they could bring down bombers quickly, the escorts might not matter. While effective against the big American bombers, these heavier cannons proved clumsy in dogfights with Thunderbolts. Their slower rate of fire and limited ammunition left German pilots vulnerable once the escorts arrived. Many were shot down before they could even fire a meaningful burst. The irony was bitter. The very weapons designed to destroy bombers left them defenseless against the fighter that guarded them. Desperation even drove German commanders to alter their broader strategy. Instead of focusing solely on bomber formations, some units began targeting the escorts directly, hoping to thin their numbers before turning on the bombers. But engaging Thunderbolts head-on was a costly gamble. Few survived such encounters, and those who did often returned with aircraft so riddled with holes that they were barely airworthy. The Luftwaffe had shifted from offensive hunters to reluctant defenders, constantly on the back foot, reacting to the Jug's strengths instead of dictating the terms of combat. Eyewitness accounts from Luftwaffe veterans reveal how demoralizing these tactical shifts became. One recalled being ordered to attack a bomber stream escorted by Thunderbolts, knowing full well that his chances of surviving were slim. It was not courage anymore, he admitted after the war, was obligation. Another described the futility of massed attacks. We went in with 20, and we came back with 8. The bombers were untouched. The Thunderbolts tore us apart. Such testimonies reflect not just the physical toll but the psychological collapse. The Germans were adapting, but every adaptation seemed to meet an American countermeasure that was even more effective. Meanwhile, American pilots noticed the changes and responded with confidence. They wrote in their reports how German tactics grew more cautious, how formations were less aggressive, how pilots seemed more eager to disengage than to press attacks. The once feared Luftwaffe aces, men who had terrorized the skies in earlier years, now fought defensively, avoiding prolonged battles with Thunderbolts whenever possible. The Jug had forced them into this posture, stripping away their initiative and leaving them trapped in a cycle of failed adaptations. In the end, the Luftwaffe's attempts to shift tactics highlighted the imbalance of the air war by 1944. Every change they made was a reaction to the Thunderbolt, a patch on a crumbling system that could not withstand the weight of American industrial and tactical superiority. The P-47 had taken what the Germans thought were its weaknesses: size, bulk, weight, and turned them into strengths. It dictated the rules of combat, and the Luftwaffe, once masters of the sky, were reduced to scrambling for survival. By the time the war entered its final stages, the tactical shifts mattered little. The jug alongside the Mustang had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. German pilots still flew, still fought, but the fear was always there no matter what tactics they tried. The Thunderbolt was waiting, its guns ready, its bulk unyielding, its dominance unquestionable.